right, hopefully that's working. So we've reached kind of a slower, I don't know if it's slower, this class always moves along quite rapidly, because we just have so much stuff to get through. But, you know, Thomas Birch offers us really if I can use an overused word that's been taken out of the context, deconstructs. He deconstructs. A word I don't like to use because it's kind of overused. Kind of takes apart the whole meta-ethical project of mid to late 20th century North American, primarily North American, Australian environmental ethics. And this business of trying to identify moral status in ecological wholes, or in any particular entity, whether an individual or a whole. But today's also, you know, so far we've spent a lot of time, and it seems like most or all of the moral struggles that we've looked at all term long have involved either a species, or maybe a group of species, and an endangered species, endangered genetic lineages. I always like to say genetic lineages instead of species, because genetic lineages is a more encompassing term that includes subspecies and subspecies, right? Because really, and I do that out of habit mainly because I always think about the salmon, and even though there are only 7 species of salmon that historically migrated up our waterways here in the Columbia Basin, there were thousands. I keep pointing out there were thousands of subspecies. So we like to talk about genetic lineages instead of just species. In any event, all the moral struggles we've looked at have involved either an endangered place, a wilderness, an alpine valley, or an endangered species, or a group of endangered species. And then, of course, we have this other, huge story going on about anthropogenic climate destabilization, right? Which is a story involving genetic biodiversity, genetic lineages, ecosystems, and of course human civilization, at least we could say. But we've looked, so I mean, what are the moral struggles we've looked at? We've talked about Hetchetchy and Mineral King, right? I try to put those side by side. It's kind of instructive to think, how in the case of 2 alpine valleys in the Sierra Nevadas, they look somewhat different, but they're both, high alpine valleys that were valued by wilderness enthusiasts, outdoor recreation enthusiasts. And one of them was outside of a national park, the other one was inside. The one that was inside got demolished, right? That was Hetchetchy. The one that was outside ended up getting saved. And that was Mineral King. And Mineral King was a case where environmental ethicists, and for some reason Congress took the environmentalists' views quite seriously. I think mainly they just kind of were skeptical of the idea of a ski resort right there. But interestingly enough, right around that same time period, the Congress was debating the fate of another dam, of Tellico Dam, of a dam. There was no dam. There was a ski resort happening, right? That ended up, Congress in the late 70s finally said, we don't want this to be made into a ski resort. We want this to be part of the national park. And we made a mistake originally. We should have included it originally in the national park. So they did that, right? And wrapped that all up, and now Mineral King's been protected, hopefully forever. But right around that same time, there was a large dam that was already partially constructed on the Little Tennessee River, just above the confluence of the Big Tennessee River, as part of the Tennessee Valley Authority, which is kind of the southeastern part of the United States' answer to the Columbia River Basin dams that we have here, right? A whole network of 30s and 40s Depression-era New Deal hydro projects were built under the authority of the Tennessee Valley Authority. This huge federal agency that developed the hydro resources of a whole bunch of rivers in the southeast Tennessee, Georgia. I don't know the details. But anyway, what happened in the mid-70s was Congress had passed the Endangered Species Act. Okay, so this is really a story about the Endangered Species Act in its original form and then how it was amended within the first decade of its existence. Originally, it was passed in what we would have to call a very stringent form that required any species, regardless of its commercial value, could be the most absolutely just wretched, pathetic little thing that nobody cares about, right? But as the language is originally written of the Endangered Species Act, there's no compromise, right? If if it can be, you know, if a group of people brings suit and demonstrates to the satisfaction of the court that this particular species is jeopardized, it's in danger of extinction, is at risk of extinction at some level, right? And this project that the government has been asked to approve, right? Just about everything, you know, needs some kind of approval. So anyway, if you can demonstrate to a court satisfaction that there's enough scientific evidence that this project, timber sale, dam construction, what have you, is jeopardizing this species, no matter how worthless it is, no matter how insignificant and pathetic it is, right? Then, according to the original language of the Endangered Species Act, all construction needs to come to a halt, right? And a plan to recover, to save and recover and restore that species needs to be conceived and debated and then implemented, right? That's all under the Endangered Species Act, which was signed into law by Richard Nixon, the Republican president, 1973. So anyway, the first test of this very stringent version, this very stringent language of the Endangered Species Act came up just a few years later, in the mid to late 70s, this debate over Tellico Dam, right? The dam had already been partially constructed. And then a professor, I'm not sure if he was a law professor or I'm not sure what, but anyway, he took some students up to these creeks around where that were going to be flooded by this dam, right? And he found these fish, this species of fish called a snail darter, okay? And I don't know anything about snail darters, but I don't know if they're a family of fish, but anyway, evidently there is at least one subspecies of snail darter that is unique, that is endemic to this stream and they thought existed nowhere else. And so, boom, this was brought to the court's attention, an Endangered Species Act filing was made, and this project, which the federal government had already invested hundreds of millions of dollars in, they invested quite a bit of money in it already, and it was partially constructed. It had to come to a screeching halt, okay? And I need to shorten the story a little bit, but what ended up happening was Congress amended the Endangered Species Act. Congress was really interesting, you know, when you look at how they treated Mineral King, just goes to show that the ski resort idea probably wasn't a very good idea to begin with, right? Because I mean, if this Congress that's trying so hard to build this dam, to approve and get this dam built, you know, it seems like they would have favored, if there was anything good to be said about the ski resort development, they would have said, okay, go for it, but they said that. Anyway, but here they said, we really want this dam, and so we're going to amend the Endangered Species Act and include a provision in there for what came to be known as a God Squad, which is a group of high-level politicians and administrators, some of them from Congress. I think 8 or 12 people are on this God Squad, right? And it's only been invoked a few times, right, since the mid-70s when this amendment was adopted of the Endangered Species Act. But essentially what it provides is that when there are serious economic repercussions of a potential Endangered Species Act listing, like the Tellico Dam situation, I mean, really serious economic deprivation is taking place, and people are just outraged and calling their congressman, what do you mean, you know, a stupid little snail darter, who gives a crap, build the damn thing, we need jobs, right, et cetera, et cetera. Anyway, so they passed this, and at that point, and ever since, the Endangered Species Act has been weakened. And so now, in some situations, Congress and this God Squad has to do this balancing act, right? To balance out economic benefits from a project with harm to an endangered species, okay? And that's why it's called the God Squad, right? These people are playing the role of God, is what the suggestion is, right? They're playing the role of God, they're deciding whether or not this species is significant enough in the face of this economic project that they've got going on here to warrant, right? So are they going to play God and do the right thing and save the species like God would have done, or are they going to, anyway? But you know what happened, interestingly enough, is that the God Squad convened, and this was the first situation they had to look at, and they concluded that the dam was a total waste of money. So again, you know, Congress was rebuffed, and the developers were rebuffed. And so at that point, Congress passed a special law, just overriding the Endangered Species Act in this one instance, and the dam ended up being constructed. And then a small footnote at the very end of that story is that snail darters were discovered to exist in 1 or 2 other tributaries. So evidently they didn't get wiped out by Tellico Dam. They still exist. But I was reminded of this whole story by by a news article. Did you guys see those rednecks who somebody got into Death Valley and they broke into this area that's all fenced off and secure where the desert pupfish lives? And it's also endangered. There's this amazing fish that can stand the warm water and the high, I guess it's salty or alkaline, or anyways, the water is very, very difficult for anything else to live in, right? But these fish manage to live there. These Death Valley pupfish, I think is what they're called. Anyway, but these three people, I guess, broke in there and started shooting, just firing guns at all the signs, and they were drinking alcohol and vomited, and anyway. And evidently, one of these pupfish, they found the body of a pupfish floating, and there are only 56 of them in the whole world, right? And they're all right there in these little springs, right? They're in these springs that come up in the Death Valley, which is the hottest place on Earth, right? Anyway, so now they haven't identified these people, right? But they're trying to find out. There's evidently some video surveillance of their car, and one of them left his boxer shorts in the pool or something. Anyway, it's just disgusting. They vomited. And they seem to be but they were doing things deliberately to vandalize and sabotage, right? To me, when I read this article, it reminded me of one of these militant, groups that think that there shouldn't be any federal government at all. And they're the kind of guys that would, if they knew anything at all about pupfish, they might try to poison them all, just to eliminate the federal government's excuse for having that facility there, right? Evidently, they weren't bright enough. Thank goodness, they didn't do something really crazy. But anyway, species. So we're going to continue thinking about species and how we can conceive of our moral obligations to endangered species. And that seems to be at the heart of much of 20th and 21st century environmentalism. So we went through a bunch of stuff on environmental pragmatism last class, and today I think we might end up getting all the way to some more salmon in the Columbia Basin and another moral struggle. It's not really it is a moral struggle involving treaty fishing rights, but it's mostly just the story of how these treaty fishing rights came to be and what their status is today. And it's really another amazing story, actually, the story of the Stevens treaties in the Columbia Basin. But let's see what else we can get through here. These are just review. There's our friend William James. That last class was sort of a confrontation between the meta-ethics of an environmental pragmatist, of William James in particular, and the meta-ethics of our new friend Holmes Ralston, who is our objectivist. So I'm not sure how much of this we got through. But anyway, so I'm not sure if I even have any page of notes specifically on our reading for today, on Tom Birch and our reading for Thursday. Maybe I've got some more of that, but I thought that it would be good to dig deeper into environmental pragmatism. And I'm presenting environmental pragmatism to all of you along. We've concluded, right? We've concluded the meta-ethical portion of our journey. Okay, and we started just by trying to set up some foundations for our journey by looking at really, we started with just anthropocentric environmental ethics, right? And we started by thinking about Group B conservationists as still anthropocentrists, but also radical environmentalists, right? But so far, and I guess all of these thinkers that we've read so far, including especially Collicutt and Ralston, think of themselves and their life work as being integrated. They conceive themselves as presenting an integrated environmental ethic that can be used, that makes sense, that holds together metaphysically and practically, and that can be used by resource managers. Okay, but there are also anyway. Right now I'd like to turn our attention to a few different integrated and fairly tested. Certainly, this can be said of deep ecology. Deep ecology has been around for 40 years, more than 40 years now. Certainly, this can be said of environmental virtue ethics, which, though not totally organized the way deep ecology is, has been around in bits and pieces since at least Henry David Thoreau in the 19th century. But these are environmental ethics that involve an effort to integrate, not just have an ad hoc set of reasons for being kind to the environment, right? Some of them, some of them just prudential, some of them, most of them anthropocentric, and then some of them, related to the intrinsic values of species, but all ad hoc, right? Thrown together, bits and pieces to try to support a certain position in a moral struggle, right? We've looked at all the different elements, right? We've looked at the three different questions. I've tried to organize our inquiry around these three different questions, right? The axiological question, what has moral status? What basically has moral status in and of itself, right? The normative question, what is the test of a right natural resource policy? And then the originary question is always kind of lurking around with us too, right? The originary question being, what are the generative conditions of moral norms? How are moral norms generated? Culturally, socially, biologically, genetically, etc., right? All these different answers. And we've noticed that sticking close to a Darwinian consequentialist, moral norms are tools to help long-term human survival, answer to the originary question, right? The more we answer the originary question, like a Darwinist, right? Moral norms emerged, were generated out of a need to protect the long-term interests of the human community, right? That's the Darwinian answer. It's very much of a tool to get something done in the long term, right? And it seems as though that answer to the originary question commits us to a certain kind of answer to the normative question, because we're going to be consequentialists, right? If we answer the originary question like a Darwinist, this is where moral norms come from, right? Then we end up answering the normative question like a consequentialist, and we also, even more painfully perhaps from an environmental ethicist point of view, we end up answering the axiological question from an as anthropocentrists also, don't we, right? So when I say that Rolston is not a Darwinist, which I did say last class, and it haunted me a few days afterwards, because everyone knows that, in a very important sense, Rolston is a Darwinist. Obviously, he accepts evolution, he accepts deep time, he accepts the idea that species branch off from each other and become increasingly more, adapted and specific and diverse, right? So in some very important, in the most important respects and fundamental respects of all, Rolston has to be called a Darwinist, right? But he does not answer the originary question the way that when Darwin turned his attention to this originary question, right? Well, and he turned it, right? And he had to attend to the originary question because he had to respond to the challenges from religious people, right? Religious people have an easy answer to the originary question, right? You learned that in Sunday school, right? You have something called a conscience, and your conscience is a part of God, right? And this gives you a guide, it gives you a moral compass. That's where moral norms originate, right? Very easy answer, right? Given a theocentric background, if one accepts the theocentric background, then hey, that's a great answer, right? But Darwin refused that answer, right? He couldn't. He had to refuse that answer, so he had to have his own kind of answer, right? And the answer that he came up with is the answer that later on became developed, for example, by E.O. Wilson as sociobiology, right? The idea that moral norms are somehow correspond to genetic conditions, right? And so moral norms emerge as a consequence of these genetic bonds right? But it's always going to be a consequentialist answer because moral norms serve us, right? Everything that happens to a species, for a Darwinist, right, happens as the result of that species' effort to adapt to its conditions, right, to its environment. And humans had to adapt to these conditions that involved extreme vulnerability as individuals, right? We're extremely vulnerable as individuals, but as a group, we're extremely strong, right? Because we have this rationality, we have communication, we can cooperate, get things done, right? But Rolston says, that there is also another. That may be one potential source of moral norms. Particularly are the moral norms that are in, that control, that regulate our interaction with other human beings, right? Rolston doesn't want to reject that. That's a partial explanation, Rolston says, right? But Rolston's giving us a non-consequentialist normative theory, and he's giving us a more than anthropocentric axiology, right? So he can't be answering that. He cannot give us the same answer to the originary question that a Darwinist like Collicutt is going to give. So in that sense, in the sense that he's not a Darwinist with respect, the way he answers the question, where do moral norms originate, is fundamentally different, right? They don't originate just as this project of survival for humans, right? No, they originate culturally. They evolve through culture, and as culture ascends a ladder, as it were, toward better and better apprehension of the truth, then that ladder includes apprehension of moral truth, right? Apprehension of truth includes apprehension of moral truth, right? And so as cultures develop, their moral norms develop. But they don't develop genetically, biologically, they develop culturally. And so for Rolston, there's a whole third layer. Rolston's most recent book, I think, came out a few years ago, and it's called The Three Big Bangs, I think that's what it's called, Three Big Bangs. And he wants to talk about these three huge events in the emergence of reality today, right? And the first event was the emergence of matter, right? The second event was the emergence of life, and the third event was the emergence of culture. So, and it's not until we get to that third level that Rolston thinks we get moral norms regarding the environment, okay? But it's not as though those moral norms are relative, okay? Anyway, I don't want to get too bogged down in that. Obviously, Rolston, being a meta-ethical objectivist, does not get bogged down in worries about relativism, the way that Collicutt and the way that the environmental pragmatists do, okay? For example, Norton's theory is always teetering on the edge of relativism, isn't it? You might always ask, what Norton says, ultimately our obligations to preserve ecological wholes are rooted in our recognition of their importance to our long-term human interests, right? And that's sort of a relative formulation of what our obligations are, right? I mean, if we didn't recognize, then we wouldn't have those obligations, right? And furthermore, Rolston wants to say something much stronger, right? He wants to say that our obligations to ecological wholes are rooted in this intrinsic moral order, right? Now, that's something, the idea of intrinsic moral order is also rejected by the environmental pragmatists, okay? So, meta-ethically, they come down on the side of Collicutt, and as I pointed out last class, they have the same philosophical ancestry, right? And then now you might scratch your head. So far, I've presented Rolston very sympathetically, haven't I? I try to present, I do, because I admire Rolston tremendously, and he's very, very influential. And he's one of those guys that is very challenging, right? And I don't criticize him lightly, but I am uncomfortable by some of the metaphysical commitments that he's made, right? The Achilles heel of the neo-Humeans is relativism, and that's an Achilles heel that the pragmatists share too, right? And the Achilles heel of Rolston and the objectivists is questionable metaphysical commitments. So we're kind of like, what do we do, Are we going to go with some of those, maybe they're not so questionable, and okay, we can slide firmly into the shoes of a neo-Kantian and be good natural resource managers, right? And then we don't have to worry about being relativistic, right? But if we don't want to make those questionable, if we identify those commitments as too questionable, right? Then we're going to have to go down the other path, right? Follow the neo-Humeans, but then the environmental ethics that we come up with are always going to be kind of teetering on the precipice of relativism, right? And you can end up being in a position to compromise, right? Like Norton is, right? Doesn't Norton compromise himself by saying that ultimately the reasons we want to protect the environment are for our long-term human interests, right? Doesn't that expose him to developers saying, well, our long-term human interests involve developing the potential resources that are here, right? Like in the Columbia River. Anyway, So I don't know, and there's a sense in which environmental pragmatism, too, unless we can figure out a way in order to explain how a species and an ecosystem makes a moral claim, then perhaps environmental pragmatism, like conservationism, like all of Norton's work, maybe Norton's right. Environmental pragmatism ends up being holistic, but always anthropocentric. All right, that could be the case if we can't, right? Because there has to be a moral claim, right? If there's not a moral claim, then the resource manager does not have a moral obligation. Okay, a direct moral obligation. We still might have all kinds of moral obligations to genetic lineages, right? But unless we can explain how a genetic lineage itself is making a moral claim, then it cannot have any intrinsic moral status, and whatever obligations we have regarding it are obligations toward one another or toward other entities that do have intrinsic value, but not to the genetic lineage, right? Which means, again, we're back to an anthropocentric, prudential, what's good for humans kind of ethic, and that's not really an environmental ethic, okay? So we've been bounced, again, out of where we want to go, which is out into the wild where we can explain why we have direct obligations, directly, and why a thing like a climate system might have moral status, okay? So how might, right? And I suggested, perhaps we can borrow from Rolston to explain how a genetic lineage might be making a moral claim. That seems to be part of what Rolston's arguing anyway, right? A genetic lineage, over a long period of time, an evolutionary historian can recognize that genetic lineage is slowly and, almost like it has intention, adapting step by step to a closer fit with its environment. And so perhaps we can, over a long period of time, recognize a genetic lineage as an entity that's doing something, right? Getting closer and closer to its ideal fit with its environment. And then we can start thinking of a genetic lineage as an entity that is making a moral claim, right? And then as environmental pragmatists, we can plug it in up here, and it's an experiencing entity making moral claims, right? And that's how we can see a genetic lineage as being lit up from within with moral status. Okay? But if we can't do that, then perhaps environmental pragmatism has a limit, where we can perfectly well describe why we might have obligations to one another, to save biodiversity, right? But we don't have any obligations to the species themselves. And that may be the best that environmental pragmatism can offer us. And then that wouldn't be good enough for deep ecology either, right? Deep ecology wants to redeem the kind of insight that Rolston redeems. You'll find when we get to deep ecology and Arne Naas, probably the thinker that most closely resembles Arne Naas and the deep ecologist is Holmes Rolston. And perhaps Holmes Rolston has resolved certain things a little better than the deep ecologists. But anyway, we'll see. Next week we're reading Deep Ecology, right? So this is our week for environmental pragmatism, and I'm taking liberties with Thomas Birch, all right? Thomas Birch is not a self-described environmental pragmatist, but I think his work is consistent with environmental pragmatism. So I'm going to use this opportunity this week while we're studying Thomas Birch's essay to present more environmental pragmatism to you. Next week will be our week 8 will be deep ecology. I believe we're spending a whole week on deep ecology, and then week 9 we're doing social ecology and ecofeminism. Maybe week 10 we're doing anyways, we're doing social ecology and then ecofeminism, and then finally we're concluding the term with environmental virtue ethics. So that's what, 5 comprehensive, systematic environmental ethics that kind of, each of which tries to present itself as tied together and sort of giving us an answer to all the questions that we've been chasing after all term long. All right? That's kind of where we're going. So I don't know how much of this stuff we need to cover. I think this is where I left off. Little last human example. We might have gotten here too. Yeah, we got all the way through there, didn't we? All right. So for environmental pragmatists, there's a whole theory of truth and goodness that comes with pragmatism, that environmental pragmatists just extend. This theory, there is no abstract truth that we're all trying to get to, right? Truth is not written in stone. Truth, the truth is always fallible, and it's always being revised, okay? And the good is also being revised. The best we can say about truth is that in natural resource management, the truth is that set of assertions about human use of natural resources which is most likely to prevail in the long run. And you remember this kind of language from Brian Norton's essay. All right, the truth in any particular situation is that which is sustainable, and the good, meanwhile, very similar explanation of what the good consists in. That set of assertions about natural resource values which is most compatible with respect for all the other sorts of values that are interwoven with natural resource values. A good policy is one which is consistent with sustaining as many as possible of the other values known to be associated with that set of natural resources. All right? Environmental pragmatism tries to determine not which resource management principles are true, but which are adequate to uphold certain shared intuitions about what is needed to live a good human life. That's all a bunch of language. All right, then there is some stuff about, I remember now, I only started including Thomas Birch in my syllabus last term. Last term was the first time that I had my class read this essay, and I'm very fond of it. Thomas Birch is a very interesting guy, too. This and one other essay that he published, both of these essays, both this one and his other, they were both published in the journal Environmental Ethics. And then other than these two fairly long essays that he published in Environmental Ethics, he really doesn't have any other publications under his belt. He taught. He's emeritus professor of philosophy at University of Montana, I think, in Missoula. Anyway, he's been there since the early 70s, had his little career there. And pretty radical guy from the sound of it, and now he's retired. But he kind of brings us to the idea that perhaps the effort to identify the philosophical basis of moral status in non-human entities, perhaps that whole project is a bit misguided. And perhaps it unknowingly and unnecessarily concedes too much to the exploitive worldview, right? To the worldview that treats most natural resources as things for humans to exploit. In a sense, right, that Thomas Birch really is kind of a devastating accusation of of mainstream North American environmentalism. And he's not alone. He's not a voice in the wilderness with this criticism either. He represents kind of this early 21st century, late 20th century criticism and deconstruction of